I spent 10 years crafting the perfect trap to destroy the girl who ruined my life. But I didn't realize until it was too late that I had walked straight into a much deadlier game. Now, the mask has slipped, the ballroom is a crime scene, and the people holding the strings are coming for the one thing I possess that could bury them all. The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored cardstock that smelled faintly of expensive jasmine. It felt ironic, considering the last time I had smelled anything near Tiffany Miller, it was the acrid scent of hairspray and cheap perfume in the high school locker room 10 years ago. Back then, I was the girl with the oversized sweaters, the nervous twitch, and the target painted on my back. Tiffany was the queen bee, the girl who made sure everyone knew exactly how far down the social hierarchy I lived. The card invited me to her exclusive reunion gala, which was clearly just a thinly veiled stage for her to show off her new life and, presumably, remind me of how little I'd achieved. My friends told me not to go. They told me that people like Tiffany don't change. They just get better at hiding their venom. But there was a part of me, a small, bruised piece of my teenage self, that felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the event. I had spent a decade building a life that was entirely my own, far away from the stifling judgment of my hometown. I wasn't the same girl who cried in the bathroom stalls while Tiffany and her clique laughed outside the door. I was someone else now, someone who walked with purpose and wore confidence like a second skin. So, I bought the dress, booked the flight, and decided that if she wanted a spectacle, I would give her one she'd never forget. The venue was an upscale mansion on the outskirts of town, draped in fairy lights and teeming with people who looked like they had been airbrushed into existence. As I walked up the marble steps, I caught my reflection in the polished brass handles of the double doors. I saw a woman with steel in her eyes, someone who couldn't be broken by a sneer or a cutting remark. I pushed the doors open, and the hum of conversation inside dipped momentarily as the crowd caught sight of an unfamiliar face. I didn't care. I scanned the room, my heart beating a steady, rhythmic pulse in my ears, until I locked eyes with Tiffany. She was standing near the center of the ballroom, holding a champagne flute like a scepter. When she saw me, her perfectly manicured smile faltered, just for a split second, before she smoothed it back into a mask of patronizing sweetness. She began to weave through the crowd, her entourage trailing behind her like satellites orbiting a dying star. She looked at me from head to toe, searching for the girl she remembered, the one she could easily tear down with a single word. She was looking for weakness, for the nervous shuffle, for the downward glance. Instead, she found me standing tall, meeting her gaze with a calm, unnerving silence that seemed to irritate her more than any insult could have. "Well, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," she drawled, her voice loud enough to command the attention of the surrounding guests. A few people snickered, anticipating the show. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to afford the dress, let alone the travel expenses. Did you have to borrow that from a thrift store, or is it a knockoff you found online?" The silence that followed her remark was heavy, charged with the collective breath of everyone watching. She was waiting for me to blush, to stutter, to apologize for existing in her pristine, golden world. I didn't smile, and I didn't back down. I reached into my clutch, not for a tissue to hide my shame, but for my phone. I didn't say a word, just tapped the screen a few times and held it up, displaying a document that caused the color to drain from her face faster than I thought physically possible. The ambient noise of the party seemed to drop away, leaving us in a vacuum of sudden, sharp tension. Tiffany's hand, which had been holding the champagne flute so elegantly moments ago, began to tremble, and the glass rattled against her rings. Her eyes weren't just wide with surprise. They were filled with a raw, frantic terror that I hadn't expected to see so quickly. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden silence of the room. "How do you have that?" I leaned in, my voice dropping to a low, cold whisper that cut through the room like a blade. "You invited the wrong person, Tiffany. You wanted a victim to mock, but you forgot that some people spend 10 years preparing for a moment of justice. And you have no idea what else I brought with me. As I watched her composure shatter, I realized that I hadn't just come here to prove I had changed. I had come to dismantle everything she had built. She turned, desperate to signal her security, but she froze when she saw two men in dark suits standing by the entrance, their gazes fixed firmly on her. She looked back at me, her mouth working, searching for a defense that didn't exist. It was then that the music stopped entirely, and a voice from the doorway rang out, cutting through the stillness with terrifying clarity. "Tiffany Miller, we have a warrant for your arrest regarding an organized scheme that goes far deeper than anyone in this room imagines." The ballroom, once a stage for Tiffany's shallow vanity, turned into a scene of chaotic disbelief. The guests, draped in designer silk and dripping in diamonds, shuffled back as if a contagion had been released. The two men in dark suits, representatives of the Service of Internal Security, didn't move with the haste of common police. They moved with the lethal, measured precision of predators who had been tracking their prey for months. Tiffany's face had gone the color of parchment, her carefully constructed persona crumbling into a pathetic display of panic. She looked around, desperate for someone, anyone, to jump to her defense. But her usual lapdogs were already retreating, distancing themselves from the fire they now realized was about to consume her. "There must be a mistake," Tiffany stammered, her voice lacking its usual sharp authority. "I don't know what this is about. I'm a businesswoman, a philanthropist. This is a social event, not a place for this." She tried to laugh, a shrill, jagged sound that fell flat against the stone walls. She glanced at me, her eyes pleading for a reprieve, perhaps hoping that I was somehow behind this and that I could be bought or intimidated into silence. She didn't understand yet. She still thought of me as the girl who sat in the back of the class, terrified of the sound of her own voice. She didn't realize that in my decade of absence, I hadn't just moved on. I had evolved into the very thing she feared most, the person who held the receipts. I stepped closer to her, invading the space she usually kept guarded by her entourage. "You spent years looking for ways to break people, Tiffany," I said softly, loud enough only for her and the encroaching agents to hear. "You thought the world was yours to manipulate, that you could use your family's influence to hide your participation in an organized scheme. You thought you were untouchable because you had money and a reputation. But you forgot that every secret leaves a digital footprint, and I spent a long time becoming an expert at tracking them." I watched as the reality settled in. She realized then that the reunion wasn't a party. It was a trap, and I was the one who had set the bait. The lead agent stepped forward, his expression carved from granite. "Tiffany Miller, we are acting on evidence involving multiple accounts and intercepted communications. You are under suspicion of involvement in an organized scheme and are being detained for further questioning regarding the movement of illicit funds." He didn't even look at me. He looked only at her, his posture radiating the weight of the massive, looming legal consequences that would surely follow. The crowd began to murmur, a low, frantic hum of speculation. Tiffany's father, a man whose presence usually sucked the air out of any room, was nowhere to be found, having likely been tipped off or already brought in for his own share of the mess. "You're ruined," I whispered, the words carrying the weight of 10 years of suppressed anger. "Everything you built, every bit of status you used to climb over others, it's all gone. And the best part? I don't even have to lift a finger to destroy you. You did it to yourself." Tiffany's defiance flared one last time. "You think you've won? You're just a ghost from my past. You'll be nothing when this is over, just another person trying to tear down those who are better than you." She reached out, trying to grab my wrist, perhaps to scratch or claw, but the agents were faster. They moved with a seamless efficiency, pinning her arms behind her back with metal cuffs that clicked with a final, chilling finality. The sound resonated in the silence of the room, a heartbeat of cold reality. She was being dragged toward the door, her heels clicking uselessly against the polished marble, when the lead agent stopped. He turned back, his gaze lingering on me for a second, a look of grim acknowledgement in his eyes. He leaned in closer, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the horrified crowd. "We appreciate the information you provided, but there's a complication. The documents you submitted, the ones that linked her to the organization, they were also used to trace the source of the encryption. We've discovered that there was a third party involved in the planning, and they didn't just target her, they targeted you too." My blood ran cold. I had thought I was the hunter, the one who had maneuvered everything perfectly from the shadows. But as the agent's words sank in, the floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. The logic clicked into place. The mysterious anonymous emails, the untraceable bank accounts, the sudden ease with which I had gained access to these documents. It wasn't all me. Someone had been holding the strings all along, and I had been a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice finally wavering. The agent didn't smile. He looked at me with a mix of pity and warning. "The organization doesn't leave loose ends, and they certainly don't appreciate being exposed by a whistleblower," he said, nodding toward the darkened windows of the ballroom. "Look outside." I turned, and through the reflection of the glass, I saw a black sedan idling at the end of the driveway, its headlights flickering once, twice. A signal. The door of the sedan opened, and I saw a silhouette step out, watching me. I realized then that my revenge wasn't the end of my story. It was merely the trigger for a nightmare I hadn't even known existed, and the person standing by that car was holding something that made my skin crawl. A photo of me, taken from inside my own home, just hours before I had left for this gala. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The cold, analytical mind I had spent years honing suddenly felt like a liability, a vulnerability that had been exploited by someone far more calculating than Tiffany Miller could ever hope to be. The person by the sedan wasn't just watching. They were waiting. I looked at the photograph the figure held, a grainy, high-resolution shot of me in my kitchen, taken from an angle that suggested a camera hidden in a smoke detector or a vent. My pulse quickened, a drumbeat of panic echoing against the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. I had come here to strip Tiffany of her power, to force her to stare into the abyss of her own corruption, but I had failed to see the much larger abyss staring back at me. "Who is that?" I whispered, my gaze locked on the figure by the sedan. The agent beside me didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his collar, his expression hardening. "We don't know yet," he admitted, his voice tight. "But the organization we've been investigating is a sprawling, multi-layered machine. When we started pulling at the threads, we realized that you weren't the only one collecting evidence. You were being fed information by someone who wanted to dismantle this from the inside, but they weren't doing it out of kindness. They were using you as a lightning rod." The ballroom suddenly felt like a glass cage. I looked back at the door, but the agents were already ushering Tiffany toward a side exit, her muffled protests and frantic cries fading into the night. I was alone, standing in the center of an opulent, empty space, a target painted on my back that I had only just realized was there. I reached for my phone to call my contact, the anonymous source who had provided the initial trail, but the screen flickered, a strange, garbled sequence of code flashing across the display before the device went completely dead. I turned back to the window, but the sedan was gone. In its place, the gravel driveway was empty, save for a single, discarded envelope lying directly under the glare of the security lights. It hadn't been there when I arrived. A primal instinct, one I hadn't felt since my school days, urged me to run, to leave the building, to disappear into the night and never look back. But my feet moved of their own accord, drawing me toward the exit. I needed to know. I needed to see what was in that envelope. I stepped out into the night air. It was sharp, biting, and smelled of oncoming rain. I crossed the marble terrace, my heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the stone. As I reached the edge of the driveway, I knelt to pick up the envelope. My hands were shaking, a betrayal of the composure I had worked so hard to maintain. I ripped the heavy paper open. Inside was a single piece of paper, thick and cream-colored, much like the invitation I had received. But there was no jasmine scent here. There was only the faint, metallic tang of ink. The note contained a list of addresses: my childhood home, my current apartment, my workplace, and the hotel where I was staying. Beside each address, a time was logged. The last entry was for the current time, with a small, hand-drawn map of the property I was currently standing on, with a red X marked exactly where I was kneeling. My heart stopped. I slowly turned my head, scanning the dark perimeter of the mansion's sprawling gardens. The shadows seemed to elongate, shifting as if they had a life of their own. I heard a soft, rhythmic click, the sound of a safety being disengaged on a piece of illegal weaponry. It came from the dense line of trees bordering the driveway, a sound so precise it couldn't have been anything else. I stood up, the note fluttering from my grip, and realized the exit I had used was already blocked. A second sedan had pulled in, its headlights cutting through the darkness, blinding me. I was trapped between the mansion and the encroaching forest, the sound of heavy boots crunching on the gravel echoing from two different directions. I retreated toward the glass doors of the ballroom, hoping to lock them, but they were already being pushed open from the other side. A man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the low brim of his hat, stepped out. He didn't look like a cop. He looked like an executioner. He held a small, black device in his hand that began to emit a high-pitched, steady whine. My phone, which I was still clutching, suddenly vibrated violently, burning hot against my palm. A single text message lit up the dark screen, the glow illuminating the man's face just long enough for me to see a jagged, familiar scar running along his jawline. A scar I had seen only once before, in a yearbook photo of Tiffany's older brother, who was supposed to have died years ago. The text read, "You should have stayed hidden. Now, you're part of the history we're scrubbing." I bolted toward the back gardens, heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. But as I sprinted into the dark, I tripped over something concealed in the tall grass. I fell hard, the wind knocked out of me, and as I scrambled to get up, I felt the cold, hard barrel of something heavy pressed firmly against the back of my neck. "Don't move," a voice hissed, cold and devoid of humanity. "You've done enough work for us today. Now, we're going to discuss how you're going to clean up the rest of this mess." The metallic cold of the barrel against my vertebrae felt like a winter wind trapped in steel. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat, as the weight of the situation descended upon me with crushing force. This wasn't just about Tiffany or some petty high school grudge. I had been a pawn in a game played by people who treated human lives like disposable currency. The man behind me, the brother who was supposedly buried in a grave 10 years ago, didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he reached down with his free hand and snatched my phone, crushing it under the heel of his boot until the glass crunched into dust. "You really are as clever as the report said," he murmured, his breath hot against my ear. "But clever is dangerous. You thought you were dismantling an organized scheme? You were just clearing the path for us to take over the pieces that Tiffany was too incompetent to manage." He hauled me to my feet, his grip like a vice. He didn't drag me toward the forest. He steered me back toward the mansion, right into the path of the retreating guests, who were now being herded toward their vehicles by figures dressed in identical dark suits. The guests were terrified, silent, their faces masked with the realization that they had just witnessed something they were never supposed to see. As we walked, I noticed the agents who had supposedly arrested Tiffany were now bowing to this man. My stomach churned. The Service of Internal Security had been infiltrated, compromised, or perhaps they were never truly there at all. "You're going to walk into that foyer," he whispered, steering me toward the grand double doors. And you're going to tell the remaining guests that this was all a misunderstanding. You're going to blame the confusion on an elaborate, poorly executed prank. And if you stumble, if you even blink the wrong way, we have a very long list of people you care about who are currently waiting for a knock at their door. He released my arm just enough to let me walk on my own, but his presence was a shadow at my back. I looked at his face. That jagged scar was a map of a violent past I had been shielded from all these years. He wasn't just a ghost. He was the architect of the chaos that had defined my life. I realized then that my vendetta against Tiffany had been a carefully curated illusion. Every piece of evidence I had discovered had been planted. Every lead had been funneled to me by this man, all to ensure that when the time came, there would be a public fall guy, Tiffany, while he consolidated his control. I walked into the ballroom, my legs feeling like lead. The room was deathly quiet. The elite of the town stood clustered in the center, their eyes wide with fear as they watched me approach. I looked at their faces. Lawyers, local officials, titans of industry, all of them looking at me, expecting an explanation. I saw a woman I recognized from the school board, her hand trembling as she clutched her pearls. They were waiting for the girl who had been bullied to be the hero, to tell them that the danger was over. But as I stepped into the light of the massive crystal chandelier, I saw him standing in the shadows of the mezzanine, his hand resting on his coat as if to emphasize the hidden, heavy object tucked away inside. He was watching, waiting for me to recite the lie. My mouth felt dry, my tongue heavy. I had one chance. If I spoke the words he wanted, I would be safe for tonight, but I would be bound to his service forever. If I spoke the truth, I was a dead woman. I took a deep breath, the jasmine-scented air now cloying and nauseating. I looked out at the room, scanning the crowd. I spotted a man in the corner, a retired investigative reporter I had known years ago, the only person here who still possessed a shred of integrity. He was looking at me with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. He knew. He saw the way the man behind me held his hand to his coat. He saw the terror in my eyes. I stepped up to the makeshift podium where Tiffany had been standing only moments before. I tapped the microphone, the feedback screeching through the room like a dying animal. The man in the shadows straightened, his eyes narrowing. I looked him dead in the eye, and then I turned to the reporter. "Everything you've seen tonight," I began, my voice steady, gaining strength with every syllable, "was not a prank. It was a warning." The man in the shadows started toward the podium, his hand moving with predatory intent. I didn't wait for him. I grabbed the microphone stand, swinging it with all my might into the nearby fire alarm station. The deafening blare of the alarm shattered the silence, a chaotic, rhythmic pulse that threw the entire room into pandemonium. In the confusion, I dove under the podium, pulling a small, heavy drive from the hidden lining of my dress, the real, encrypted evidence I had been protecting all along. But as I scrambled toward the side exit, a hand grabbed my ankle, dragging me backward toward the encroaching darkness. I turned to strike, only to see the face of the man who had been my only ally in the city, holding a suppressed, illegal weapon pointed directly at my chest, his face twisted into a mask of cold, calculated greed. He wasn't there to save me. He was there to claim the evidence for himself. The cold steel of the weapon pressed against my ribs was no longer a surprise. It was the final, inevitable piece of a puzzle that had been trying to kill me since the moment I stepped onto that marble floor. The man I had once trusted as a mentor in the city, the one who had guided my early research into organized schemes, was looking at me with the eyes of a stranger. The mask of the helpful veteran reporter had fallen away, replaced by the hollow, hungry gaze of a man who realized that the drive in my pocket contained enough power to buy a country. "You played a beautiful game, kid," he hissed over the wailing of the fire alarm, his voice barely audible under the roar of the crowd scrambling for the exits. "But you were always the weak link. Did you really think you were the only one playing for the winning hand? Give me the drive, and I'll make sure you're long gone before the real cleanup crew arrives." I looked at him, feeling a strange, hollow calmness wash over me. The terror that had been clawing at my throat since the gala began had crystallized into a singular, sharp clarity. I realized that the reason the security agents had been so easily manipulated, and why the brother of my bully had been so confident, was that they were all fighting for the same piece of the pie. They were vultures tearing at the same carcass, and they had forgotten that I had spent 10 years learning how to survive by blending in with the shadows. "You're right," I said, my voice cutting through the noise with a cold, jagged edge. "I was the weak link, but I'm also the only one who knows the password." His hand tightened on the weapon. "Don't bluff. I have everything I need to force it out of you." "The password isn't in your head," I countered, and before he could react, I slammed my palm against the emergency release lever of the fire suppression system located inches above my head. A torrent of heavy, chemical-laden foam erupted from the ceiling, instantly turning the opulent ballroom into a blinding, white-out chaos. The man staggered back, blinded, his grip on my ankle loosening just enough for me to kick out with everything I had. I felt my heel connect with his knee, a sickening crunch echoing in the din, and I was loose. I didn't run for the door. I ran for the basement service stairs I had memorized from the venue's blueprints months ago. My lungs burned, my dress was shredded, and my heels were long gone, but I moved with the desperate, jagged speed of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I reached the server room in the bowels of the mansion, my fingers flying across the terminal. I had one goal. I wasn't going to hide this evidence, and I wasn't going to sell it. I was going to broadcast it. I bypassed the local network, routing the encrypted files directly through an offshore relay server I had spent years constructing. As the progress bar crawled forward, the metal door to the basement groaned under the force of someone hammering at it from the other side. "Open the door!" the voice of the scarred man roared, followed by the terrifying, rhythmic thud of an illegal weapon being tested against the lock. With a final, desperate click, I hit enter just as the door blew off its hinges. Smoke and debris filled the room, and I was thrown backward against the server racks. The scarred man stepped into the room, his weapon leveled at my head, his face a mask of primal rage. He saw the screen, the green light of the upload completion blinking back at him. He realized in that split second that the documents, the records of the organized schemes, the illegal payouts, the names of the corrupt officials, and the true history of the family that had tried to bury me were no longer private secrets. They were currently appearing on every screen, every tablet, and every social media feed in the city. He froze, his gaze darting to his own phone, which buzzed incessantly with incoming alerts. He looked back at me, his face turning pale. He knew it was over. The game had changed. The hunters had become the hunted, and the public scrutiny that would follow would be far more lethal than any bullet. He turned and fled into the dark, realizing that staying to finish the job would only mark him as the primary target for the authorities who were already being flooded with the data. I didn't move for a long time. I sat on the cold concrete floor, listening to the sirens approaching in the distance, the real ones this time. I looked at the screen, watching the headlines begin to shift, the truth of the last decade finally spilling out into the light. The Tiffany Millers of the world could try to build their empires on the ruins of others, but they had forgotten one fundamental truth. When you spend a decade in the dark, you learn how to see perfectly when the lights finally turn on. The next morning, the sun rose over a city that felt different. Tiffany was in custody, her family's empire was being dismantled, and the figures who had tried to manipulate me from the shadows were either in handcuffs or in flight. I walked out of the mansion, the morning air clean and biting. I didn't look back at the grand house or the scene of the chaos. I walked toward the main road, the weight of the last 10 years lifted from my shoulders, finally breathing for the first time as a woman who was no longer defined by the girl I used to be. I wasn't a victim, and I wasn't a pawn. I was the person who had pulled the curtain back, and for the first time in my life, the future was entirely my own to write.